Microphone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the fourth week of 2016. I'm Carl Estabrook. For 25 years, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, but I was deplatformed there. Deplatforming is a recent coinage in the university and media. It means depriving someone of a place to speak because of what they're saying. I appreciate the chance to come to you now via Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, quote, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green, Ron Zoke, and I will try to say some true things. It's January 29th. On this day in the year 661, the Rashidun, the rightly guided caliphate, ends with the death of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the cousin and son-in-law of the Islamic prophet Muhammad, who ruled the caliphate for 5 years. Born in Mecca, he married Muhammad's daughter Fatima and fought in the battles of the nascent Muslim community. He was appointed caliph by Muhammad's companions in 656 after Caliph Uthman ibn Affan was assassinated. In the year 661, Ali was attacked and assassinated by a Kharajite, while praying in the great mosque of Kufa, dying 2 days later. Kharajite was an irreconcilable, a separatist. We would call him today an Islamist, perhaps. The modern equivalent may indeed be the Islamic State. In the early days of Islam, these were the people who were attacking the leadership as it existed in the first four caliphates. Sunni Muslims consider Ali the fourth and final of the rightly guided caliphs. Shias regard Ali as the first imam after Muhammad. Shias also believe that Ali and the other Shia imams were the rightful successors of Muhammad, and the disagreement on the succession to Muhammad split the Ummah, the Muslim community, into the Sunni and Shia branches. The modern divisions in this area owe much more to David Petraeus than they do to Ali and the Kharijites. In 1834, on this day, U.S. President Andrew Jackson ordered the first use of federal troops against striking workers. In the year 1863, on this date, the Bear River Massacre occurred. California volunteers of the U.S. Army, it was a unit of the U.S. Army, during the Civil War, led by Colonel Patrick Edward Connor, attacked Shoshone people at Bear River, Washington Territory, that's now in Idaho, killing hundreds of men, women, and children. On this day in 1996, La Fenice, Venice's opera house, was destroyed by fire. And there is an interesting and culturally quite deep account of this event, circumstances, and its follow-up in John Barron's wonderful book, The City of Falling Angels, from 10 years ago. So you're watching News from Neptune, a destruction edition, and David Green will strike the first blow.
Lots to talk about today, especially after a couple of weeks off. And I guess I want to address Bruce Rauner's state address to the legislature from a few days ago, just in very general terms. Nothing new here. I read through the text of his address, and it relies on the same canard, the same misconception, misunderstanding, or perhaps lie, that only business people in the private sector actually create jobs, when in fact the only way that we're really going to create jobs to actually increase demand to put people in the private sector back to work is to create jobs in the public sector. And the only way we're going to create jobs in the public sector, first we have to restructure the state taxation system, a topic which is studiously avoided, it seems to me, in debates around whatever the Republicans had to say about Rauner's statement or whatever Democrats had to say about Rauner's statement. It's clear that in a regressive tax state like this one, in which the people who make half the money are only paying 7 or 8% in state and local taxes, and the people who make much less than half the money are paying 13% of their income in state and local taxes. You need a radically revised taxation system at the state level, also in order to take pressure off property taxes at the local level, as well as sales taxes at the state level. This would either have to be a wealth tax on the people who have socked away all the wealth that, again, isn't doing anything to actually create jobs because it just sits in the stock market. You would have to either get wealth taxes from those people, or at least get income taxes or progressive income taxes from those people. So either we have to face up to constitutional changes in this state to allow that to happen, or we have to at least raise the flat tax to a level at which you're talking about real money. You're talking about the 10 or 20 or 30 billion dollars we really need in this state to make it a decent state, to put people back to work, to provide free education from daycare to higher ed, and so forth. Another thing you can't talk about, of course, even though our last governor, our Democratic governor, allegedly supported single-payer health care, was that if you tax people at the state level in order to pay for health care, you will actually save billions of dollars when it's all worked out, and people look at their paychecks and businesses look at their bottom line and the government looks at its bottom line. In spite of the billions of dollars that will have to be taxed to pay for single-payer health care, that will mean even more billions of dollars left for other either public or private needs, whether in the public sector, again, higher ed or daycare or whatever, or in the private sector, leaving people more in their paychecks. And all of this, again, could take a lot, fundamental tax reform at the state level could take enormous pressure off property owners and homeowners at the local level. The one thing I guess they're talking about, they allegedly agree on, is that we need a different state level funding formula to fund public K through 12 schools. But what you also need is a lot more money funding K through 12 public schools at the state level, so as it doesn't have to be funded. It shouldn't really have to be funded at all through local property taxes or local sales taxes. There should be an entirely state funded. That's the only way we could even claim to have an equitable K through 12 educational system. So the Republicans, of course, don't want to face up to this. The Democrats don't want to face up to it, even though they have a supermajority in both houses of the state legislature, which could pass a bill, for instance, unless there's something I don't understand, they could raise the state income tax to a certain level and raise the exemption to a certain level, so it wouldn't hurt lower income people that much. I'm sure that I would think that there's a way of doing that. I would think that there's a constitutional way of doing that. Maybe there's a reason why I've never heard this talked about, but I think the reason is only political, really, that the Democrats don't want to take the responsibility for beginning to change this incredibly broken taxation system, and therefore being able to change the other systems, put people back to work, and begin to do some of the things that we, as a rich state, can well afford.
Thank you, David. I think what we'll do now is go to Ron. Ron has a list here of things that he wants to mention and come back around because I want to comment on a lot of the points that David has raised already. So let's go to Ron and complete the list, and then we'll go back. We'll go back around.
David, is it or is it not considered, and rightly so, political suicide to talk about raising taxes?
Well, there's a lot of, I mean, that's what the 1% would like you to believe. But I think if most people understood the consequences of raising taxes, especially raising taxes to save money on, to overall save money on health care, people would look at it differently. I don't think it's political suicide. It's because people just don't want to try it. The entrenched interests want to maintain the fiction that's political suicide. And I think at the national level, Bernie Sanders is proposing things that are considered to be political suicide as well, and he's only gaining more support for doing so.
Well, I hope you're right, but okay, I think it's a problem, and I don't want to talk about hypothetical future states, but for most people, I think it does seem political suicide to talk about raising taxes. And there's the problem in Illinois, of course, of changing the Constitution.
Yeah, I mean, but it's certainly not political suicide to talk about raising taxes on the wealthy, who have all the money, who make the 1% that have nearly half of the wealth, or the 10% that have at least 3/4 of the wealth, or the 20% who make 50% of the income. That shouldn't be political suicide. It's just a numbers game. The other 80% of the people understand perfectly well that their paychecks have been stagnant, and that all the money is going to that half the money is going to that upper 20%. And it's just a matter of people coming along and explaining these things in a clear and rational way that isn't muddied by the manner in which the media covers it.
I think there's another point here, too. I mean, maybe you should examine the metaphor to say it's political suicide to talk about raising taxes. What, in fact, does that mean? It means that the people or the party that raises taxes offends the holders of wealth, offends the 1%, offends those who might actually be affected by it, and therefore they're not willing to do it. As David points out, there's no reason that you couldn't construct a tax regime, even in Illinois, that falls upon those who have excessive income, increased income. Even though a flat tax is mandated by the state constitution, the 1% worked that a couple of years ago. Nevertheless, there are ways of getting around it. Even the Democratic majority in the legislature proposed a millionaire's tax. Mr. Madigan proposed a millionaire's tax twice, in fact, a tax that would fall only on a few. Because there aren't that many millionaires around, after all. But in spite of the supermajorities the Democrats have in the legislature, it failed because a few Democrats managed to vote against the Democratic Party's proposal for a millionaire's tax. There are those cynical enough to suggest that that's what Madigan had in mind all along, that it was a gesture to propose the tax in the first place, knowing that he could pull the plug on a couple of Democratic legislators who would vote the other way, and make sure that such an offense to LaSalle Street, to Illinois' Wall Street, would not occur. So the notion of it's being political suicide is very interesting. As David suggests, it's possible to produce a majority in the state of people interested in taxing those with the greater ability to pay. But apparently our parties aren't willing to do it because they don't want to offend those people.
Yeah, there are certain obstacles which I'm calling attention to here today. With this mask of Ganesh or Ganesha, the Indian elephant-headed god who's the remover of obstacles. And there are certain obstacles in the way that will have to be removed. One is the Constitution. Another is the reality, it seems. I'm trying to avoid wishful and magical thinking here of trying to raise the taxes, even if it's only the very rich. They have many people on their payroll, the flax and PR agents and so on. And you're making it sound as if it would be easy or feasible to do.
Reasonable, yes. Easy, no.
Yeah, okay. I think it was Governor Samuel Shapiro many years ago who brought in the idea of there being a state income tax. And he knew the result of that, what that was going to be, and he was willing to take the fall in order to get it because it was so desperately needed. But we have to have some other politician who's sufficiently suicidal to bring that in, and in the hope of saving the state. But there are very few people who are that self-sacrificial, it seems to me. Ganesh reminds us that there are certain obstacles in the way of reform then of that possibly could be removed. And I will invite our viewers, if any, to think about what and who those obstacles are. And does an election year give us an opportunity to remove some of those obstacles? And I think there is an opportunity now coming up. So just be grateful that I didn't bring in my the enema kit for cleansing the body politic. But
Thank you.
But one thing you reminded me to say is that it's something I read this morning on Andrew Levine's Counterpunch column. He refers to a philosopher whose name I can't recall right now, who's apparently pretty well known, who made a famous quip about pragmatism works in theory, but not in practice. and he did that by way of arguing in the context
Never heard that.
in the context in terms of the debates around whether Hillary Clinton will be able to get things done more than Bernie Sanders would be able to get things done were he or she elected president. And I think it's a good point. I think that Bernie Sanders is beginning to dispel some of these notions that the Democratic Party, to get elected, A, and B, to get anything done, has to move towards the center, which is really the right.
Yes,
really from right of center to even more right of center, as opposed to being very clearly at least to the left of center, as Bernie Sanders is.
yeah. Well, okay, I've started.
Just to comment on that, David Swanson posted today, well, I'll put it on the News from Neptune website, an interview with Jill Stein of the Green Party on just these issues. And the line is that Jill's platform is in fact more viable than Bernie Sanders, and that people who are enthusiastic about Bernie Sanders' platform should be even more enthusiastic about Jill Stein's. And that may be the basis upon which we can build a discussion that's not entirely right of center. I would hope so.
Yeah, well, I would have to see the actual result of that. But anyway, next point, I want to talk about polls and polling and some of the skepticism that seems to me in order. Points made by Frank Bruni in the New York Times recently. Polls are notoriously volatile. Last week's poll will lend support to something that will be devastated by the next week's poll, and so on. And it's a problem. How much weight should we assign to these polls telling us what's up, what's down, who's in, who's out, what's popular, and what's not? So this is an article, Our Insane Addiction to Polls, in the New York Times, January 23rd. There's a lot wrong with polls. Examples, polls can't call cell phones, which is the only phone that many people have today, because there's a law against automated mass dialing of those things. And that came about because people were, or maybe still are in many cases, charged for incoming calls as well as outgoing calls. And many people have been annoyed, as I have been, by the push polls that go on, which are these polls where if I told you, or the interviewer asks, if I told you that candidate X supported this and this measure, would you be more or less likely to vote for them, and so on. And those, for the most part, are completely phony. So if you want to find out something about polling, I recommend you look at website 538, Nate Silver's
Yes.
website. He has a listing there of dozens of polls that are conducted across the country, and their apparent accuracy to this point anyway. He was the very best poller in the last presidential election. He got everything, every one of them essentially right concerning who was going to win ultimately. The worst was the Republican poller Rasmussen, who kept telling us that Mitt Romney was certainly going to win because the other polls were all skewed and against Romney and so on. There was even a column by him in the local daily for a while, but he is so wrong about most things that I think they even
One of
gave
my
that.
letters to the editor was in response to one of those columns
Yeah.
a while back.
Yeah.
Why did you bother?
Yeah. So
Why do I ever bother?
right. Right. So this is a
not the same
continuing problem, the plausibility of the polls. The big book about public opinion and polling is this one by VOK, apparently, in American Democracy, of many years ago. It was the big book in the 60s, I should say. It was published in 1961. And he has an interesting paragraph or two about polling results. Page 425. Those who advocate a new policy exert their ingenuity to phrase it in terms that will make it consistent with values widely accepted. Those who are in opposition attempt to picture the action as one that diverges markedly from all that is regarded as good and holy by the populace. Security payments to the aged, for example, may be portrayed as a ruthless assault on American individualism or as a noble implementation of our humanitarian belief that the aged should not lack food or shelter. A recurring illustration of these propositions consists in the attempts of opponents of reform measures to pin a socialist label on such measures. The American people, in an inconsistency incomprehensible to doctrinaires, oppose socialism, yet manifest a tendency to support specific measures that may be in principle socialistic. In a 1934 study of a Pennsylvania county, George Hartman concluded that most of the voters in his sample wanted specific measures for which socialism stood, but did not want to have them labeled that way. In the locality of the study, he opined, the people would, quote, prefer to have the Republican Party be the vehicle of introducing socialism to America, end of quote. National samples have shown a similar pattern of opposition to socialism, quote unquote, and support of measures regarded by the analyst as socialistic. So the Psychological Corporation, shortly after World War II, found that 75% of their national sample opposed socialism in this country. Good numbers of their respondents, though, supported specific measures such as the TVA, which they even conceded might be steps towards socialism.
Tell our younger viewers that TVA means the Tennessee Valley Authority,
Right,
the public energy producing system in the Midwest.
And it was heavily criticized in the 1930s and 40s, being a step towards socialism. Horrors. And the whole thing is just too funny. And this book, by the way, came out 55 years ago, and not a lot has changed in some respects. What else should I add?
While you're looking, let
Obama.
me make one comment on the rhetoric of socialism. The thing that has surprised me in this winter has been the speed with which the shibboleth of socialism has been dissolved by the Sanders campaign.
Yeah.
That may be its major contribution finally, when Sanders is finally ushered off the stage, as I think he will be. I hope not, but I think he may be. What will happen is that the word socialism is back into the American political vocabulary. We have to understand, as Ron was pointing out, how vigorously several generations of Americans, going back not just to the New Deal, but indeed to the First World War, how American opinion leaders have worked very hard indeed to poison the wells of discussions about socialism. Not even beginning with the Russian Revolution, but long before, with the debates about socialism in the 19th century in America. I had occasion to remark the other day that it would be desirable to have Americans as familiar with the discussion of socialism in 2016 as they were in 1916. Right. When it was a topic that an educated person would know about and talk about, in part because of the labor struggles and the moves towards socialism in American society. Profoundly scared the Wilson administration and led to some of the greatest mass suppression of politics and politicians in America up to before the Obama administration. So the idea that socialism should suddenly reappear, in this winter as an acceptable term, you see various polls, sorry about polls, polls of young people, millennials, saying that, yeah, they consider themselves socialists rather than capitalists. Right. That's really quite remarkable.
Yeah. Okay, next point. The Donald Trump contretemps of yesterday, a specter is haunting America, that of Karl Marx. From the National Review online of the 27th, after years of false alarms, the conservative crack-up has arrived, according to Jonah Goldberg, one of the heavies at the National Review, Bill Buckley's old publication. The level of distrust among many of the different factions of the conservative coalition has never been higher, at least in my experience, he says. Arguments don't seem to matter, only motives do. I've lost track of the number of congressmen, consultants, and so forth who have told me that radio talk hosts spend their time criticizing fellow conservatives because that's what brings in the highest ratings. Beating up on liberals just doesn't animate the base like it used to. Wherever the truth lies, he says, questioning motives is poisonous because such claims are not only unfalsifiable, but they also give an instant excuse to ignore sincere, reasoned arguments. Nearly every position on Trump is immediately subjected to a kind of vulgar Marxist analysis. You think Trump would make a bad president, or you're just saying that because you're part of the establishment? You think Trump would make a good president, or you're just saying that to get attention, and so on. So, immediately undercutting whatever someone else says because of their supposed personal characteristics or personal situation. So, as an added amusing note, there's been a survey of course syllabi, gathering thousands of them from colleges and universities across the country. And in the Wall Street Journal, Tom Bennis, one of the editors there, said, headline, Karl Marx is the most assigned economist in U.S. college classes. The Bible doesn't even show up in the database of works on syllabi. Trigger warning. The following blog post includes the use of ironic tone, which may be confusing or upsetting to people reading outside their safe zones. In case you had any doubts that America's college campuses are dominated by godless communists, fresh statistical evidence is at hand. More than 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the onset of market economy in China, the Communist Manifesto still ranks among the top 3 most frequently assigned texts in American universities. By contrast, the Bible doesn't show up at all. And Bennis doesn't want you to know just how ironic and sarcastic he's being here, I think. That's according to data from the Open Syllabus Project, which tracks books and other works assigned to students in more than 1 million syllabi. The database is assembled using computer algorithms that scrape the data from publicly available sites. It is still very much a work in progress, according to its website. The syllabi analyzed are primarily from the U.S. and cover the past decade or so, according to the site. Each text is assigned a count, registering the number of times it appears in syllabi, and a teaching score, a numerical indicator of the frequency with which a particular work is taught, according to the site.
Well,
there's another story citing this result and saying this is in part the result because works of Marx are assigned in history and in poli-sci and sociology and so on. So it shows up in so many of these fields, but it's so the case is not quite as clear-cut as this makes it sound. So there's your trigger warning.
Well, you know, what the fall of the Soviet Union did a quarter of a century ago was to loosen things up enough to give people the freedom to begin to discuss seriously Marx's work. And of course, the person most famous for doing that is the geographer and anthropologist David Harvey, who taught a class on Marx's Capital and videotaped that class, and you can watch it online and learn a lot from doing so. But the question, it won't go away because Marx understood capitalism so well at a basic level. The question won't go away. Capitalism is a system that brutalizes people, that accumulates wealth, that destroys the material environment, that creates massive social inequality systemically, that moves from crisis to crisis. And when people begin to understand that, not through the lenses of demonizing what was really the state capitalism of the former Soviet Union, people begin to understand that we need to look for an alternative to this system, that this system really, this neoliberal capitalism, as we call it now, really cannot last. It cannot last in environmental terms. It cannot last in human terms. It cannot last because it leads us into wars, into war after war. And by the same token, America's capitalistic control as the only superpower in this context can't last either. It destroys the world, especially the Middle East as well as other parts of the world, but it's destroying the social fabric of our own country. So this question does have to be, the system has to be questioned at a very fundamental level, and to do that takes a lot of understanding of how the system works and how it goes off the rails, and how conservatives. I read in Charles Krauthammer's column in the News Gazette from the Washington Post this morning that a true conservative is one who believes in limited government. Yeah. And Marco Rubio, and that Ted Cruz is a true conservative as Marco Rubio. Donald Trump is not a real conservative because he does have a populist element to what he's saying, which is why he's so popular mostly. So, but I read this nonsense about conservatism being for less government, but it's not for less government, as we all well know. It's for a highly militarized government, highly incarcerationist government, as well as a government that bails out the big banks and is always there when the business community needs it to enforce its way of doing things.
Yeah, I have a
its
comment
patents
on that.
and so forth.
Yeah.
So it's just nonsense, and people just need to begin to understand, and are beginning to understand, that government, it's whether we have a democratic government that represents the interests of the people, and how that can change, how that can either modify or change or entirely get rid of capitalism as we know it.
Yeah. The big government or more government shtick is really interesting. People say that, conservatives say that they're against big government, except in certain cases of abortion, voting, welfare eligibility, aliens and refugees, in which in every case they want more rules, regulations, restrictions, and requirements imposed by the government. curious, isn't it?
Well, of course, neoliberalism, as the name of American politics for the last generation and more, is a peculiar invocation of big government to protect the profits of the 1%. What exactly happens in neoliberalism is a revolt against that arc that runs from the New Deal through the 60s that said we need more democratic control of the economy. And the response of American business was to say, no, we want the government to control the economy for us. That's what laissez-faire as a 19th century slogan, no longer applicable to a world in which the government must guarantee the profits of the few and destroy the social supports that have been won by popular struggles. And this reaches a certain high point in the current administration when the crowning achievement of the Obama administration is the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, these two multi-nation trade pacts agreements that will in fact remove business from the control of the government by government fiat, so to speak, by the establishment of these treaties. So as Ron suggests, the invocation of big government is deceptive at the very best. I want to make one comment about Ron's quotation of the syllabus study in the New York Times, where they contrasted the reading of Karl Marx and the reading of the Bible, by which they mean the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament together, I'm sure. Yeah. I taught both in my teaching career, such as it was, in a variety of institutions. I taught Marx, and I taught the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament as a historian of Christian thought. And the first point I'd make about them is that they have far more to do with each other than you might think. The Abrahamic religions, which is the academic shorthand for Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, the Abrahamic religions begin in politics and indeed end there. The idea that they are spiritual and removed from the political world is an ancient heresy in all three. They're all about how people live together in society. They begin there. The rejection of what is generally taken to be religion, and all three Abrahamic traditions begin by rejecting what people take to be religion, is a rejection of the notion that something spiritual is going on, and an insistence that something physical, human, real, material is going on. They are materialist traditions that reject the idealist traditions of other religions. Now, we find that difficult to understand unless we look at the history of the development of these traditions and look at the history as well of the rise of the capitalism, as David described it, and the socialist critique of capitalism, which Marx was involved in. Marx didn't spring fully armed from the head of the Rothschilds. He was a participant in a vigorous discussion about, as David said, the nature of capitalism. What is this modern world that we have constructed in the 19th century? And I might say parenthetically that it means that if you're going to take either of these texts seriously, the Bible and the Marxist ratings, you have to put them in a historical context and look at the modern developments of these traditions. The capitalism that Marx described in the middle of the 19th century is remarkably protean. It's changed in all sorts of ways, and since Marx was not really very interested in socialism, that wasn't what he wrote about, he was interested in capitalism, to take seriously his work, to read it then and apply it now, is to look at the changes in capitalism that have gone on in the last 150 years. This is, seems to me to be good advice to these syllabi that Ron was talking about. Read the text, and read the text in terms of the contemporary situation.
I guess Marco
Yes.
Rubio last night, as he was referring to his Savior, Jesus Christ, forgot to say that Jesus Christ might be a socialist if he were around today.
He wasn't particularly happy with bankers either. Right?
Yeah, right.
That's probably playing fast and loose. I mean, who knows what he would be, but anyway. The other thing is just that the whole business of talking about these things in terms of capitalism and socialism, the notion that Marx was struggling with, and that we've been struggling with ever since, is that there's this idea that there is such thing as a free market that kind of runs of its own, like how do you say it? Deus ex machina of the 1600s. Free markets are always governed by laws, and they're always governed by social conventions of various kinds. And when the 1% gains its wealth not from the free market, but from controlling the political system, which governs the rule of that free market. If you look at the four highest paid groups of people in this country, you have doctors, lawyers, CEOs, and financial managers, and a few engineers of various kinds. And these professions all come to their high incomes and their eventual accumulated wealth from having the market for entry into those professions highly regulated by the government in ways that most people take for granted, are understandable and have to do with qualifications and so forth. But there's more going on than that.
Yeah.
In limiting the supply of people who can practice medicine or practice law and so forth.
Some try to sum that up as saying that they're adept at gaming the system.
I don't want the hour to disappear entirely before we say a word about the ongoing wars in the Middle East. The peace conference that was supposed to have begun today in Geneva looks like being postponed. It's not clear who's going to arrive, in part because the so-called rebels in Syria are saying they're going to stay away unless they have some demands met beforehand. It's very difficult to see this move as not being sponsored by the U.S. The U.S. is in a position where it can hardly refuse to participate in this peace discussion in regard to Syria, but it doesn't want to. The Obama administration has been promoting war in Syria all along and has no desire to see a cessation of the war. The way in which the war has developed now into a confrontation between Russia and the U.S. comes down to the fact that the U.S. wants to continue the war because it's in U.S. interests, in its control of the Middle East, and Russia wants to end the war because of the danger posed to Russia itself by Islamicism in Syria and by the alliance that Russia has with Iran in Syria. So the peace conference looks like not happening, but what is more disturbing perhaps is that there's no discussion about the real policy that the U.S. is following in killing people in the Middle East in the presidential debate at all. Particularly shocking in the circumstances is the way in which the most progressive candidate, Bernie Sanders, is talking about it. He says, and I'm quoting here, "I think the president is doing everything that he can in trying to defeat ISIS. But when I hear words like enduring conflicts, it makes me very, very nervous. I think it opens a door wider than it should be. I think we've got to continue airstrikes. I think we've got to use special operation forces when we can. But I do not want to see a never-ending quagmire in the Middle East where our troops die, come back with terrible illnesses, and we end up spending trillions of dollars. Once again, this war is a battle for the soul of Islam, and it's going to have to be the Muslim countries who are stepping up. These are billionaire families all over that region. They've got to get their hands dirty. They've got to get their troops on the ground. They've got to win that war with our support. We cannot be leading the effort. I want to make sure that our young men and women are not fighting a never-ending war in the region, not getting killed. I want to make sure the leaders of the effort are, in fact, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Jordan, and the UAE. I want the Muslim nations to take the lead. I want their troops to be on the ground. I want them to be aggressive. I want them to be spending the money necessary to defeat ISIS. I want us to be in a supportive role, but not leading the conflict. Now, this is so fundamentally confused, it can't even be accidentally confused, that it seems to me that it's most shocking that there's no real discussion of it. The discussion is disappeared into the analysis of Donald Trump's hair or something. A comment on Sanders' views runs as follows. Same Orientalist nonsense, Bernie. We will support Israel, the Arabs have to fight, and we cannot do it for them. The soul of Islam is at stake, blah, blah, blah. And Bernie is supposedly the sensible, smart one, for crying out loud. How about this for change? End aid to Israel, respect international law, apologize for all the wars the U.S. started or instigated, and accept international jurisdiction over war crimes. In support of corrupt, brutal Arab regimes, notably Saudi Arabia, and for God's sake stop talking gibberish about Islam, since religion has little to do with the mess your country created in the first place. That seems to me to be just about right. And the fact that discussion is not taking place at any part of the presidential debate, with the possible exception of Green Party candidate Jill Stein, I think is a scandal. Gentlemen?
Well, yeah. We see, again, I think the nirvana fallacy on display here.
The what fallacy?
The nirvana fallacy.
Nirvana?
Yeah.
Like as in the highest level of consciousness or whatever.
Rejecting,
You need to explain that.
Rejecting feasible intermediate steps because they are not leading to perfection.
Feasible intermediate stuff means killing slightly fewer people than we have been
It may
up to
mean
now.
that in some cases, yes.
But withdrawing the troops, the American troops, and the 1,000 American bases from the region, this is impractical. This is
It will not happen immediately. Well, I can't say whether it's practical or not, and you can't either. It seems highly implausible to me that this will happen in the next decade or generation, but it could happen. It's something that should be constantly advocated, I think, and worked toward. But that's another matter. And are we veering off into wishful and magical thinking here again, which seems unavoidable in these contexts? And once again,
Ron, to say that
the
there's no
perfect is
debate
the enemy
going
of the
on,
better.
to say that there's no debate going on in the presidential election about the wars that the U.S. is carrying on in the region. There isn't even an adequate description of what the wars are like and what's going on. Even Bernie Sanders, the progressive climate, has an absolutely fantastic notion, maybe that's what you mean by nirvana. That piece that I just read from Bernie has very little relation to the facts, very little relation to why people are being killed at a great rate in Syria and Iraq, and it certainly doesn't propose anything that will stop it.
I see.
Well, but there's
By the
just-
way, who do you think Noam Chomsky recommends voting for?
He suggests that Bernie Sanders is by far the best candidate, although he thinks that his view
But
will
by the same token, there's a
not
there's a film
instigated.
there's a film coming out this weekend, another documentary film about Chomsky, which sort of purports, and I think probably accurately, to be the definitive documentary film on his views. It's basically an interview film called Requiem for a Dream.
The American Dream, I think, yes.
Yeah, and it's opening up in New York at one of the places where movies open up, and it's going to be available shortly. And maybe Bernie Sanders ought to watch it, because I think, as long as Chomsky is endorsing him, I think that Bernie Sanders, he may in fact know some of these things. I don't know. Sometimes I don't want to make assumptions about how naive or how sort of feckless Bernie Sanders might be about some of these foreign policy issues, but you have to relate what's going on, our military policy and our foreign policy around the world, as obstacles towards him achieving some of his policy goals.
Absolutely.
And perhaps he does say, I guess, that part of the way he would fund his programs would be through cutbacks in military spending.
Yes.
He does say that, right?
I think so.
Yes.
And so that seems to would lead to a critique, a more fundamental critique of foreign policy. After all, our military spending, in terms of its basic Pentagon level, hasn't really changed all that much in the last 20 or 30 years. It's expensive. It's a lot of money. But it isn't just the money. It's the fact that we have these policies that relate to the manner in which global capitalism works, that are integrally related, as Panich and Gindin argue in their book, The Making of Global Capitalism. These things can't be separated. So therefore, we have to understand what the fundamental structure is of this global economic system, which is dependent on American business and finance and the dollar and the Federal Reserve and all that, and that is one part of it, and the other part of it is how it affects our inability to make any progress at having even a modestly moving towards some sort of welfare state measures, or back to some welfare state measures in this country, given the manner in which budgets are constrained because of military spending and because of other kinds of spending. Budgets are constrained, and all of a sudden, there's not enough money. There's always enough money for war, but there's not enough money, even though it would be much less expensive, to fund free higher education for everyone who needs it or is qualified for it. So, Bernie has to, in order to keep going, in order to surprise the critics by being truthful and by gaining a following for being truthful, he really does need to extend into foreign policy and begin to say some true things about that.
Exactly.
Yeah, I suspect Sanders is pretty naive about foreign and military policy, and
I don't think
because
there's
he's
any
never
reason
really
to
had to
believe
deal
that.
with it.
Naivete. I think
Yeah.
it's his political views, right?
Okay, he's vicious and evil.
Well,
Is that the
Are those the only
idea?
choices? How about saying he's wrong about that, and we should be having a discussion about it, and we are.
Okay, Carl.
That seems better to me.
Okay. Yeah, you've mentioned certain obstacles, and how do we remove those obstacles? I think by doing, some of what we're doing here today is trying to clarify these issues and highlight what the problems are and so on, and trying to be somewhat realistic about what those obstacles are along the way.
But some of us on the left, I think, make a mistake by making assumptions about the quote unquote masses, and even the conservative masses, even the kind of people who are being attracted to Donald Trump, what it is they can and can't understand, and what it is they will and won't support. I think we need to be open to, there was a famous book, probably the experiments in truth, or something. Probably doesn't have anything to do with this whatsoever, but it's a nice line. But it's like, why don't we just try being truthful before we make assumptions about what people can and cannot do, who they can and who they will or will not vote for, what is or isn't possible. Why don't we just try avoiding all these pitfalls that have to do with the polls and what people want to hear, and just finding out what people are willing to to begin to understand about the way the world actually works without being apologetic about the fact that people have wrong ideas, people have misconceptions about the world, but they're never complete misconceptions, because people often know the plight that they're in and the plight
Exactly.
of the people that they know that they're in. We need to stop making assumptions about what the effect of such a thing will be and just be truth tellers, I think.
It takes a lot of effort to mislead them. Here's an example from David Swanson, which I'll post. He says, I asked Green Party presidential candidate Jill Stein about her platform this week and came away believing it had a better chance of winning than Bernie Sanders. I know that platforms don't run, people do, and they do so within a two-party dominated system. But this already crazy presidential election could turn into a crazier five-way race. She's thinking about Bloomberg and the Greens, as well as the Democrats and the Republicans, and perhaps a dissonant member of those. And even if it doesn't, or if it does, but still nobody ever learns that Jill Stein exists, there is nonetheless much for us and for the other candidates to learn from her platform. If you think free college is popular, as Bernie has mentioned, you should see what young people think of free college and erasing all existing student debt. If single-payer health care with raised taxes, but net earnings, if you make it into the fine print, excites voters, how do you think they'd respond to single-payer health care with no raised taxes? If fewer wars and asking Saudi Arabia to do more of the funding and fighting sounds promising, as Bernie is saying, what would you say to no more wars, a 50% cut in the $1 trillion a year military spending, no more weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, which is doing more than enough killing, thank you, and no more free weapons for Israel either, an investment of some of the savings in a massive green energy jobs campaign, producing a sustainable energy policy and a full employment economy. Now that's what Swanson's doing there is summarizing Jill Stein's view, and the argument is that what Sanders has done and the excitement that it's produced needs to be extended in the direction of Jill Stein and the Green Party campaign, and they're rather carefully worked out Green New Deal. That sounds to me to be quite right.
That's fine. That sounds like Nirvana.
I'll see you in Nirvana.
You know, there's a difference between saying that society can work a lot better and saying that it's going to make everybody happy. I mean, the human condition isn't going to change. It's only going to make it possible for people to deal with it in a much more positive and creative and free way. I don't think Nirvana or utopias is what we're talking about here. We're just talking about people being able to muddle along a lot better in a very different social context, which offers them more genuine opportunity.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the fourth week of 2016. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been David Green and Ron Zilk. Our thanks to our directors and producers, Jason and Yosef. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4, with Neptuner David Johnson, and more news from outside the bubble, as Harry Shearer says, that you can't hear elsewhere in CU. See our Facebook page for News from Neptune, and the blog News from Neptune is back up after a long absence. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.